As we head into a new football season, it is important to remember that every year NFL Week 1 upsets occur. You will have unheralded sides or cellar dwellers knocking off much more fancied opposition. Despite this though, the media and fans just have the most epic meltdowns when these occur. It is as frustrating as it is pointless. Maybe instead of repeating past mistakes, let's try to learn from them. With that in mind, on the Touchback today, we are going to go over the 11 biggest NFL Week 1 upsets in history. We start in the odd 2020 COVID season. The Jacksonville Jaguars would win a lone game in that campaign, and it happened in Week 1, and it happened against the Indianapolis Colts. Speaking of those Colts, they would go on to win 11 games and make the playoffs. This is the perfect example of why you don't panic and why you don't overreact if your team loses on the opening weekend of the season. Honestly though, this was a pretty good game overall, with Gardner Minshew producing some of his classic Minshew magic. It did turn out that the Jags' performance was clearly a fluke, seeing as they didn't win again in 2020. And of course, the Colts, well, they managed to get their act together in short order. During George Allen's stint as Washington head coach between 1971 and 1977, the team never finished below 500 and made the playoffs in all but 2 seasons. The rival Giants, on the other hand, never qualified for the postseason and only had 1 season above 500 over this time. That brings us to the 1977 season opener between the two sides, where the trend of success and failure was expected to hold serve. That was especially true considering the Giants were coming off a dreadful 3-11 campaign. Ultimately though, it did not happen. In a game with quite a few lucky plays, New York managed to eke out a victory. Even more interesting was the fact this was Allen's first ever loss to kick off a season. He had previously been 12-0 in openers. We do not have to go back far at all to find the next entry on our list. In 2022, this was a classic battle between haves and have-nots. Obviously, the San Francisco 49ers were much different at the start of 2022 with Trey Lance at quarterback and no Christian McCaffrey. But this was as good as it got for the Bears. We should stress that this was a case of the 49ers losing a game more than anything that the Bears did. Kyle Shanahan's side actually went up by 10 points midway through the third quarter. They then proceeded to fumble the win away through a series of turnovers, penalties, poor play calling, bad weather, and even worse execution. It would be very easy to look at the early 2000s and the records and think that this result wasn't an upset or all of that shocking, but there are a few things that it is important to keep in mind here. First, you have to remember just how bad the 1999 expansion Browns lost in their first game. A subpar Steelers team crushed them 43-0. Even the worst NFL sides at the time were light years ahead of those expansion teams, or at least in theory they were. Either way, when you looked at the newly minted Houston Texans roster on paper, it looked awful. It looked awful then, and it looks awful more than 20 years later. Even against the Quincy Carter-led Cowboys in one of America's team's darkest periods in history, most people assumed that the expansion franchise didn't stand a chance. Alas, Dallas, as they were wont to do during this period, simply couldn't be bothered to turn up. Seriously though, this was an awful game all around and not worthy of the atmosphere or primetime broadcast slot it received. It was still shocking though to see the Cowboys lose to an expansion team in 2002. The Miami Dolphins entered 1986 on the heels of 5 straight postseason bursts, including a 1984 appearance in the Super Bowl and a 1985 showing in the AFC Championship game. Meanwhile, San Diego was in the last days of Don Coryell's reign as head coach. The once innovative offense had stagnated by this time, with the Chargers having finished 500 or thereabouts for 3 straight years. The game turned out to be a swan song of sorts for the Air Coryell offense. The Chargers rushed out to a 17-0 lead and really never looked back in dispatching the Dolphins. Things did not get better for either franchise, however. Miami finished a disappointing 8-8 and missed the playoffs entirely. Over in San Diego, the team lost its next 8 contests, firing their legendary coach during this losing streak. The Chargers would finish 1986 with a record of 4-12, but this upset still holds quite a great deal of shocking value just given where the teams entered the season at. Sometimes a tie can be just as good as a win. That's especially true if you were a fan of the mid-2010s Cleveland Browns. There was obviously that wildly disappointing, wildly embarrassing 0-16 campaign of 2017, which was actually preceded by a 1-15 showing in 2016. Over in Pittsburgh, the Steelers had won the AFC North 3 out of the 4 past seasons heading into this year and were coming off a 13-3 campaign. The odd thing about this game is that Pittsburgh was pretty much comfortably in control for basically 3.5 quarters. Then some summer showers rolled in and the conditions got a bit sloppy. The Steelers fumbled twice in the final 8 minutes, with Cleveland sort of improbably scoring 2 touchdowns to tie the game up. It could easily be argued the Browns should have won this game. They had the ball inside Steelers territory with 20 seconds left. But Tyrod Taylor threw an ill-timed interception. Then in overtime, both sides would miss chip shot field goals, meaning things ended all square. After one victory in 2 years though, the tie, it was just as good as a win for Cleveland fans, and it qualifies as a pretty significant upset. Nothing says future Super Bowl champion quite like a 31-0 shutout coming at the hands of a divisional rival to start the year. Ultimately, it wasn't a problem for the New England Patriots, who would only lose one other time in 2003. On the other hand, this was basically the Buffalo Bills Super Bowl, and they would finish the season 6-10. The matchup is probably best remembered for Lawyer Malloy sticking it to the Patriots 5 days after the team released him. Sure, Drew Bledsoe was there as well, also facing his former team, but the headlines almost exclusively focused on New England's former safety facing the team that had just released him. Then again, his performance was certainly headline generating. It's also worth again saying, and I will say this probably a few more times before the video ends, results like this are why fans and media should not get too hyped or too low about what happens in week 1. Opening 1985, and you had 2 teams on the opposite end of the NFL spectrum. There were the Miami Dolphins, who had finished the previous season 14-2 and made an appearance in Super Bowl 19, where they were handily defeated by the San Francisco 49ers. The Oilers, well, they had won 13 games in total between 1981 and 1984 as the franchise struggled in the post-Bum Phillips era. It should be noted the Dolphins' preparations to start 1985 were extremely disjointed, and that had everything to do with the fact star quarterback Dan Marino held out of training camp and preseason. He was looking to get an improved contract, although the team wasn't so keen on that. Eventually, Marino reported to the team a week before the season began, but things did not go smoothly in week 1. In fact, Don Shula would bench Marino during this game after he threw 2 picks. Houston would eventually come out on top late in the 4th quarter after the teams traded touchdowns. Normal service for the 2 would resume after week 1. Miami went on to win its next 4 games, and the Oilers lost 5 straight. The 2018 opener between Tampa Bay and New Orleans is not nearly as close as the score would indicate. Tampa Bay actually led 48-24 in the 4th quarter. Similarly, this result was not indicative of the seasons either NFC South side would have in 2018. Drew Brees and company, well, they were playoff bound, while Dirk Cutter was on his way to another 5-11 campaign in Tampa Bay. While expectations were high, as they almost always were for New Orleans during this period, they were coming off the Minneapolis Miracle playoff loss, what ended their 2017 season. That hangover had clearly spilled into week 1 of 2018, where Ryan Fitzpatrick produced a classic bout of Fitzmagic in this pretty surprising upset. The Miami Dolphins were coming off back-to-back Super Bowl championships as they entered the 1974 season. The New England Patriots, well, they were not so good. The team had finished 3-11 and 5-9 over the past 2 seasons while losing all 4 matchups against their AFC East rivals. It is safe to say no one really saw this result coming when the schedule was released. A Jim Plunkett-led Patriots team raced out to a 24-7 lead in the first half, eventually bumping that up to 31-10. Miami struggled to protect quarterback Bob Greasy, while the team's vaunted rushing attack combined for a meager 89 yards on 29 carries. You could make a strong case that this game was actually the beginning of the end of the Miami Dolphins dynasty of the 1970s. A trio of stars had already been poached by the recently launched WFL for the 1975 season. If you would like to know more about that interesting episode in NFL history, you can do so right there in the card in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Here we are, the biggest NFL Week 1 upset in history, and it also happens to feature a team that was in Super Bowl 19, like the previously mentioned Miami Dolphins. The winner of that contest, San Francisco, put in an embarrassing performance against a Minnesota side that had finished 1984 a lowly 3-13. What made this all the more shocking is that the 49ers actually only lost 1 game the previous season. This just may be the franchise's worst game under Bill Walsh. Despite a roster littered with NFL Hall of Famers and high-quality players, they were unable to do much against the Vikings. Joe Montana and company somehow coughed up 7 fumbles, losing 5 of those in this game. The astonishing amount of turnovers prevented them from building any momentum against a team they were clearly better than on this day. The game would happen to take a wild turn in the final quarter when the Vikings managed to score following one of these 5 lost fumbles. On the ensuing kickoff, San Francisco fumbled again, which would set up Minnesota for the winning score. This was an absolutely stunning result and is totally worthy of its place on this list. There you have it, the 11 biggest NFL Week 1 upsets of all time. If you take one thing away from this video, please let it be this. If your team loses to open the season, and if it loses in a shocking fashion to a team that was expected to beat, do not panic, do not melt down, do not go on some epic tirade, because it doesn't matter. There are now still 16 more games to go. And as we have seen historically, you have Super Bowl champions who have managed to bounce back from these upsets. You have plenty of playoff teams, plenty of good teams. It is very easy to recover from being upset on week 1. Of course, we all know that the Monday following the opening of the NFL season, ESPN will be nothing but talking heads yelling about how all of these teams that lost or were upset are now done. That does it for me. I'm Cheyenne Hollis. This is the Touchback. Subscribe if you would like. And as always, hashtag take it up to the 25.